The year was 1943. For more than 2 years, the German Afrika Korps had fought under the legendary Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. His soldiers walked with a swagger, believing they were untouchable, destined to dominate the deserts of North Africa. Many of them laughed at the thought of facing American troops. To these men, the United States was not a nation of warriors. It was, in their words, a mongrel nation, a patchwork of immigrants with no shared discipline, no tradition of sacrifice, and certainly no chance of matching the iron will of Nazi Germany. But wars have a cruel way of shattering illusions. The turning point came at El Alamein and later in Tunisia, when the Afrika Korps was finally surrounded. Exhausted, outnumbered, and without supplies, the once proud German and Italian armies had no choice but to surrender. Tens of thousands raised their hands in defeat. The sight of German soldiers, once so feared, now walking into captivity with hollow eyes, was a moment heavy with humiliation. Many had been indoctrinated to believe they would never be taken alive. And yet, here they were, prisoners of war. For these men, fear was immediate. What would happen to them now? Some whispered about being forced into British coal mines, condemned to back-breaking labor until they died. Others feared starvation or brutal punishment in the deserts of Africa. But then came unexpected news. They were not staying in Africa at all. They were being shipped across the Atlantic to America. The announcement stunned them. To be sent deep into enemy territory felt like a death sentence. Rumors spread wildly in the prison yards. Some believed they would be executed upon arrival. Others imagined being displayed like circus animals before American crowds. The uncertainty gnawed at them, and for the first time, the arrogance of the Afrika Korps gave way to silence and dread. The voyage itself was the first revelation. Crammed aboard American Liberty ships, the prisoners peered out at the vast convoys. One German soldier later wrote in his diary, "We thought we understood America's strength. We were wrong. On a single ship, we saw more than 50 planes tied down. On another, rows of tanks and trucks. And then there were the mountains of crates, food, ammunition, supplies without end." It wasn't just the abundance that shocked them. It was the waste. Day after day, they watched American sailors casually toss bread, fruit, even meat overboard, simply because it was no longer fresh enough. For men who had fought on half rations in the desert, who had starved for weeks while clinging to the hope of German victory, this sight was devastating. One prisoner later recalled, "We knew, then and there, that Germany could never win. If America could throw away what we were dying for, how could we possibly compete?" The silence on deck was heavy. Pride cracked. The myth of German invincibility was sinking with every crate that splashed into the Atlantic. But beyond the horizon lay even greater shocks. On the other side of the ocean, these young men, once loyal to Hitler and convinced of their racial superiority, were about to meet a country that would challenge everything they thought they knew about war, about freedom, and about themselves. When the Liberty ships finally reached American shores, the German prisoners braced themselves. For weeks, they had imagined what awaited them: humiliation, abuse, maybe even execution. They expected angry mobs, spitting crowds, perhaps children throwing stones. After all, back home, their leaders had painted America as a land of chaos and hatred, a place where soldiers had no honor and civilians were bloodthirsty. What they found instead was something entirely different. As they disembarked in ports like Norfolk, New Orleans, and Boston, there were no mobs, no jeering civilians. In many cases, the docks were quiet, guarded only by American soldiers who barked orders but treated the prisoners with an almost unsettling calm. To men raised on Nazi propaganda, it was disorienting. One prisoner later confessed, "We expected monsters. Instead, we found men." The first shock came with the train rides that carried them deep into the American countryside. From the windows, the prisoners stared in disbelief. Mile after mile, they saw farms bursting with crops, endless fields of wheat and corn, barns filled with livestock. They had been told that the Allies were desperate, running on empty. But here was proof with their own eyes. America was overflowing with food. For some, the sight triggered anger. "Why do these people have so much while our families starve?" one soldier muttered. Others felt despair, the gnawing realization that Germany's promises of victory had been lies. And then came the camps themselves. Scattered across the United States, from Texas to Wisconsin, these prisoner-of-war camps were nothing like the nightmares the Germans had imagined. Barbed wire fences and guard towers stood tall, yes, but inside, life was strangely humane. Each prisoner was given a bed with clean sheets, 3 meals daily, and even medical care if needed. Many remembered how in Germany's own camps, prisoners of war had been beaten, starved, and worked to death. To receive kindness from the enemy was unsettling. Some refused to believe it. They whispered, "This must be a trick. They will soften us before the killing starts." But days turned into weeks, and the treatment remained the same. The food was the most unforgettable shock. For men who had grown used to black bread and thin soup, the American meals were almost unbelievable. Bacon, eggs, potatoes, fresh vegetables, milk, and sometimes even cake. The prisoners would sit in stunned silence as trays were handed out. One wrote home after the war, "It was in America, as a prisoner, that I first tasted oranges. I could not believe a fruit so sweet could exist in a world at war." At first, many refused to eat, suspecting poison. But hunger overcame suspicion, and soon they were devouring everything. Some even began to gain weight, something they hadn't done since before the war began. But perhaps the deepest shock was not food, nor beds, nor safety. It was dignity. The Americans, for all their hatred of Hitler and the Nazis, treated the prisoners as men. They were called by rank, sometimes even by name. Guards spoke to them, joked with them, and on rare occasions even played cards or smoked cigarettes together. It was small moments like these that shook the prisoners more than any battle had. They had been raised to see America as a weak, disorganized nation unworthy of respect. But here, in the heart of enemy territory, they were being treated with a humanity they had never expected. One German officer later admitted, "It was there, behind the barbed wire of an American camp, that my faith in the Nazi cause began to crumble." For many, this was the true beginning of captivity, not the surrender in Africa, not the voyage across the ocean, but the dawning realization that the enemy they had hated might be more human, more honorable than the regime they had served. By the summer of 1943, German prisoners of war were scattered across more than 500 camps in the United States. From the pine forests of Georgia to the frozen fields of Minnesota, from the deserts of Arizona to the plains of Texas, these young men who once marched under Hitler's banners now lived behind barbed wire on foreign soil. At first, life inside felt unreal. Prisoners woke up expecting cruelty, expecting beatings, hunger, and humiliation. Instead, mornings began with the clang of a bell, roll call, and then breakfast. Eggs, coffee, bread, butter. For men who had lived for months on desert rations, it was a feast. The days quickly fell into rhythm. Camps were not places of idleness. The Geneva Convention allowed, even encouraged, the use of prisoners for labor, as long as it was not dangerous or directly military. And so the Germans found themselves picking cotton in Texas, harvesting wheat in the Midwest, chopping lumber in the North, and even helping build roads or repair infrastructure. For many Americans, this was their first time seeing the enemy up close. To their surprise, these men did not look like monsters. They were farm boys, clerks, mechanics, just like the sons they had sent off to war. Some Americans approached the camps with suspicion, others with pity, but over time, curiosity often turned to conversation, and conversation sometimes turned to unlikely friendships. Inside the camps, another kind of transformation began. The U.S. military, guided by the War Department, quietly encouraged education. Books were brought in, libraries were built, prisoners were allowed, even pushed, to study. They learned English. They read American newspapers, novels, even textbooks. Some discovered Shakespeare and Hemingway for the first time. Others studied mathematics, science, or engineering, hoping to prepare for a life after the war. Music also filled the camps. German choirs were formed, orchestras rehearsed, and in some camps, prisoners were even allowed to stage plays. One guard recalled attending a prisoner production of Faust, performed entirely by Germans behind barbed wire. "It was strange," he wrote, "to see our enemy bring Goethe to life on a stage in Texas." In that moment, they seemed less like Nazis, more like human beings. But not every camp was harmonious. Ideological battles raged among the prisoners themselves. Hardline Nazis tried to maintain control, intimidating or even attacking fellow prisoners who dared to question Hitler. In some camps, secret Gestapo-like groups were formed, keeping lists of traitors. There were fights, even murders. The Americans, realizing this, began separating hardcore Nazis from ordinary soldiers to prevent violence. For the majority, however, camp life slowly chipped away at the myths they had been raised on. They had been told that America was a land of poverty and chaos, ruled by Jewish conspirators and greedy capitalists. But what they saw, in the food they ate, the books they read, and the way they were treated, suggested something very different. One prisoner later said, "We could not believe the Americans allowed their own leader to be mocked in cartoons. In Germany, that would mean execution." Then came music and movies. Camps often showed films as entertainment, and German soldiers found themselves watching Hollywood productions filled with laughter, romance, and heroes who were nothing like the images of greedy, corrupt Americans they had been told about. Swing music drifted through the air from camp loudspeakers. For young Germans who had grown up under Nazi bans on degenerate jazz, the rhythm was intoxicating. Some prisoners later admitted that their first love affair with America began not with politics, but with music. Work details outside the camps deepened the transformation. Farmers invited prisoners to family dinners, and churches organized Christmas gatherings where German POWs sang carols alongside American civilians. In the quiet of American nights, behind the wire, they had time to think, perhaps for the first time in years. And what they saw, what they experienced, began to unravel the lies they had once believed. By late 1943 and 1944, life inside America's prisoner of war camps was no longer just about survival. It was about exposure. Exposure to an enemy that looked nothing like the caricatures painted by Nazi propaganda. Exposure to a society that, for all its flaws, offered freedoms many Germans had never imagined. The first cultural shock came through the simplest things: newspapers, magazines, and radio. The American guards allowed, and sometimes encouraged, prisoners to read local news. They saw headlines about elections, debates in Congress, protests, strikes, and even criticism of President Roosevelt himself. For men raised under Hitler's dictatorship, where dissent meant prison or death, this was astonishing. One prisoner later said, "We could not believe the Americans allowed their own leader to be mocked in cartoons. In Germany, that would mean execution." Then came music and movies. Camps often showed films as entertainment, and German soldiers found themselves watching Hollywood productions filled with laughter, romance, and heroes who were nothing like the images of greedy, corrupt Americans they had been told about. Swing music drifted through the air from camp loudspeakers. For young Germans who had grown up under Nazi bans on degenerate jazz, the rhythm was intoxicating. Some prisoners later admitted that their first love affair with America began not with politics, but with music. Work details outside the camps deepened the transformation. Farmers invited prisoners to family dinners, and churches organized Christmas gatherings where German POWs sang carols alongside American civilians. There were moments when enemy lines blurred, when a German soldier, once sworn to Hitler, found himself playing piano in a farmhouse parlor, cheered on by children who barely understood the war at all. These experiences cracked open something inside. Many of the prisoners began to ask silent questions. Why does the enemy treat us better than our own leaders? Why do they live with so much freedom while we live with fear? Not everyone welcomed these thoughts. Hardcore Nazis inside the camps tried to enforce loyalty. They spread fear, reminding prisoners that defeat was only temporary, that Germany would rise again, and that traitors would be punished. In some cases, violence erupted, men beaten or even killed for showing softness toward Americans. The Americans responded by creating segregation camps, isolating the most radical prisoners from the rest. But for the majority, the seeds of doubt had already taken root. One striking example came from education programs. Prisoners were allowed to attend classes on history, politics, and economics. For the first time, many learned the truth about Hitler's regime, about the persecution of Jews, the brutality in occupied countries, the mass killings. At first, many refused to believe it. But evidence mounted, and with it, unease. Prison diaries tell of sleepless nights. Men who had once marched with pride now stared at the ceiling, asking themselves how much of their loyalty had been built on lies. Some admitted later that their time in America was the beginning of their second life, a life where they could question, reflect, and choose who they wanted to be. There was irony in it all. Hitler had sent them out to conquer the world. Yet in defeat, it was the enemy who conquered their hearts and minds, not with guns, not with threats, but with food, music, books, kindness, and freedom. By 1945, as the war dragged to its bloody end, many German prisoners quietly admitted to themselves what they could never say aloud. They no longer wanted Germany to win, because winning would mean returning to a life of fear. In May of 1945, the guns of Europe finally fell silent. Hitler was dead. The Reich had collapsed into rubble. And for the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners scattered across America, the war they had once believed in was over. At first, there was relief. The fear of execution vanished. But it was quickly replaced by something heavier: uncertainty. What would happen now? Would they be shipped home or kept in captivity forever? And if they returned, what would they return to? Slowly, the process of repatriation began. Train by train, ship by ship, prisoners were sent back across the Atlantic. But the men who stepped onto German soil in 1946 and 1947 they came home to devastation. Cities bombed to ashes, families scattered, food scarce, their once mighty Reich reduced to ruins. And yet many carried something unexpected back with them: the memory of America. For countless former POWs, their time in the United States had left a mark far deeper than they realized. They had tasted freedom in the simplest of ways, in books, in music, in conversations with ordinary Americans. They had learned what it meant to live without fear of secret police, without worshiping a single leader, without propaganda dictating every thought. Some struggled with guilt. They had once sworn loyalty to Hitler, only to see firsthand the humanity of the people they were told to hate. Others clung to their camp experiences like a lifeline, telling their families about the kindness of American guards, the abundance of food, the chance to learn and grow even in captivity. Historians later noted a striking fact. Many of the men who returned from American captivity became some of the strongest voices for a new Germany, a democratic Germany. Some became teachers, others became politicians, writers, engineers. They carried within them the memory of what they had seen, a society where freedom, not fear, shaped daily life. Of course, not every former prisoner transformed. Some remained bitter, clinging to the old myths, blaming America for Germany's destruction. But for thousands, the experience behind American barbed wire planted seeds that would shape the future of post-war Europe. One former POW summed it up decades later. "I came to America as Hitler's soldier. I left as something else. I did not become an American, but I learned what it meant to be free. And once you taste freedom, you cannot forget it." It is one of history's strange ironies. The men who once marched to conquer America were, in the end, conquered by America's ideas, not through battle, but through humanity. Their story reminds us that wars may be fought with weapons, but peace is often won with something greater: compassion, dignity, and the quiet power of showing an enemy a better way to live.